Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to talk to you guys about season 1 of Doom Patrol. Reasonably. This season 1 is 15 episodes, which looking at it to me was a really kind of, oh man, this is going to be a huge ordeal. This is going to be a daunting task. And looking at every episode, oh my god, like most of the episodes were from anywhere from like 40 minutes to an hour. And I'm like, oh my god. But luckily, I was able to get this entire show done within a span of one day. So luckily, I'm able to talk about this show and review it. At the end of the day, there might be some facts that I might have forgotten about, because there is a lot to process within the span of one day. So like looking at it, there might have been names that I might forget through this review, or there might be things that I might have um, kind of like, oh yeah, I know this, but like maybe not everything was like I might quickly go over a lot of stuff because it's 15 episodes. Good grief. So letting you know that we're gonna, of course, as per usual, get into a non-spoiler and then double five timed count, and then we're gonna go into spoilers about the show. There is too much to go over with this show, so at a lot of times I'm probably gonna go probably over with spoilers. It might just be like the greatest hits of things, or it just might kind of go like as quickly as I'd like to talk about a lot of stuff. So, in probably for the non spoiler portion, I might have to be very super cryptic about this show. Yeah. So, if anything, I could hands down say this is probably the best superhero show that I've ever seen in my life. And reasonably, per episode to episode, this is the most random superhero show I've probably also ever seen in my life. But everything presented in this show just bizarrely effing works. It just masterfully, craftily works. Um, how this show even knows that it probably does not have a huge fan base, but it does not care. It is obviously pointing out that this show knows that it's a show, and throughout the entire process is giving you the middle finger, and like looking at it looking at it from that perspective, when they're basically in your face giving you the middle finger, the audience, you're laughing at it, and you're laughing with them as they go out through these journeys. At this Through this show is a comedy. It is not to be taken seriously whatsoever. But as I say that this is hands down probably the best superhero show I've ever seen in my life, there are things that I ultimately could still say that in some ways, excuse me, there are some things that I didn't like about the show, and that's okay. I could go out of my way to say that, like, Cyborg. Cyborg to me honestly felt like a character that was kind of shoehorned into this show, kind of like how he was shoehorned into the Justice League roster. I really didn't feel that like Cyborg was a good fit to be in the Justice League. Um, but they kind of really went out of their way to say that no, this character is a right fit for Justice League, and I didn't really quite ever understand why. Um, they could say all the live long that like, well, we live in a technological world and blah 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 blah. But at the end of the day, I'm like, well, that's what you have Batman for. He's the technological side of it all. And also looking at it, that's why you have John Stewart as Green Lantern at some portions of time. That's why you have Martian Manhunter in the Justice League roster at portions of time. Anyways, Cyborg to me was a very odd choice to be put in here, and I ultimately felt like Cyborg was having to fight for real estate within this show. Um, Ultimately, I love his story within the show as much as pretty much everybody else. It just felt that Cyborg just felt really odd to me. It just he just stuck out like a sore thumb, and not in a good way. Um, as far as just like I felt like he was fighting for real estate the entire time being put onto this show. It felt so weird. Anyways, and there's also kind of just characters that kind of just feel like flat characters to me, or kind of like buzzkill like characters. Um, but overall, the I love the story. I love every episode, and I love how bizarre every effing episode gets. Um, God, this show, the show, man, just how it goes out on a limb to just do everything it does. So, anyways, we have it to where this definitely has to give people an origin of every single one of these characters. Even if you've kind of heard it before somewhere, they dare say is are going to give you a different kind of origin story of even like Cyborg. He has kind of a very much different origin story, but the reason for his origin story within this show is realistically for story purposes, which I ultimately just go, oh, okay, all right. Like I can go, all right, cool. Because looking at it full well, whatever, like, I think they needed to tell everyone's origin story, whoever, if people knew these characters or not. Um, but every single origin story also ties into the show's story as well. So, anyways, you also have it to where I think this is like the perfect team show. Um, Done in live action, of course. There might be better cartoon shows, but or cartoon team shows, but looking at it, this show has it to where you like every individual episode where eventually they kind of break off and spend an entire episode maybe with Cliff, or maybe with Elastigirl, or maybe with Negative Man, or maybe with Cyborg, or Chief, or Jane, which I'll talk about eventually. Um, because to me, like, I was not aware of every dare say single character that was presented on the show. I didn't know who they were. So there were some characters that I'm like, I was brand new to the whole like aspect of like, oh my god, who is this character? Like, I'm not aware of this character at all. Or even for when these characters were on Titans, I was like, okay, well, it looks like Netflix really put a lot of money into this show, and also like you could really tell, like, okay, they were kind of looking to really increase a wide range of interest and really impress people with like, okay, let's add this character in, um, and get this character to be a really substantial character to be placed in here and this and that and whatever, what have you. Anyways, so I think a lot of decisions were made just because of Netflix money. I think if this show did not have Netflix money, I think it would have been a drastically different show. And it probably would have not have been half as good, um, or even good at all. So, anyways, within this show, we have it to where a lot of the history of Doom Patrol is revealed within this episode and talked about, which I ultimately just like, all right, that's awesome. That's cool. Because there's people that might have jumped onto Doom Patrol books at some point and be much more familiar with certain kind of iterations of certain characters and are kind of confused why those said characters weren't like, well, why couldn't I have gotten this variation of Doom Patrol? Why couldn't I have gotten these characters from this kind of thing that I enjoyed or liked or whatever? And eventually, like, people probably heard or realized that, so they kind of in story added those certain characters to kind of give them a episode shelf life and whatever. But anyways, I like this new roster. Again, Cyborg, but at the end of the day, I could just say that maybe within other seasons, Cyborg might not always be there, or Cyborg might be on the Titans, or Cyborg might be, I don't know. Looking at it, this show is probably the one show that I could tell people, finally, this show is worth going to the C or the DC Universe app and watching. Everything else, I could not justify telling you to go onto the DC Universe app, downloading it, and watching it for the purpose of any of the other shows that are on this app. There might be any number of people could ultimately say, like, well, I really liked this show, or I liked that, or I like this, or like maybe people liked the Harley Quinn animated show, which I haven't started to get into, but I really want to. Um, People might have said Titans is the greatest thing on that thing, which ultimately I'm starting to watch season 2, and man, I can't wait to review that. I can't wait to review season 2 because good God, yeah, I cannot wait to review season 2. I cannot wait because yeah, because ultimately I am nah. Just wait for that review. Oh man. Anyways, so looking at it, looking at the giant amount of creativity, aka Netflix money, that was put into this show, man, just within the heroes alone, like dipping through the creativity that is presented within these heroes' story. Cause you look at it, like I would be fine with having an entire season of one of these characters rather than or also on top of them already having a show of all these characters combined. I think reasonably there's a lot of risks that just get kind of thrown into the show that I think ultimately have a huge payoff. So and a lot of people might have said, yeah, there's a lot of unnecessary risks. And man, is this show kind of very much more all over the place. And man, is this show just like so odd and so weird and so like. But I feel it needs to be. I think that this show, metaphorically speaking, needs to, in a DC kind of point of phrase, this show needs to be like Joker at his craziest. So that way, like, it appeals to everybody. Everybody wants to see a crazy Joker, whether it's a good and or bad Joker, still appealing to everybody. So at the end of the day, that's about as much as I think I want to get into this show. As a non-spoiler, very cryptic sense, because I don't want to spend an overly hugely amount of time talking about the series. I could say and go out of my way to say that there is a lot of, I guess you could say, a lot of toilet humor into this show. There's a lot of fourth wall breaking in this show. Um, there is an obvious, poignant amount of uh, even the show realizing that it's probably not going to have a huge fan base coming into this show. So um, yeah, if I hadn't said it already, this show is kind of blatantly to its audience giving the middle finger to its own audience, and but doing it in a very fun and tongue-in-cheek kind of way. So ultimately, like, when they're doing that, we can kind of laugh at them because it's like, yeah, you're funny, you're really funny. um and they do a lot of bizarre things in this show, but ultimately, like, you're just enjoying the ride. If there at any points is just kind of like, oh wow, why did they do that? Ultimately, when looking at it, it's kind of like, I don't care. I thought it was funny. I thought it was fun. I thought it was. I love that this show's odd. I love that this show is just like. I love weird. I love odd. I think it's great that this show goes out of a limb to take so many risks, and I think it's cool. I think it's cool that it's just like, here's a goofy character. Throw these goofy characters in. So at the end of the day, the best superhero show, I could say hands down. Uh, yeah, and a lot of people might not like the show, or a lot of people did like the show. So I don't know. Let's go double five time. Talk about the show in spoiler sense, because at the end of the day, again, I could say go out of your way to watch this show. Right now, currently at the second of this recording, you can watch DC Universe free for a week. So, looking at it, this trial probably won't be on the DC Universe forever, but um, at least you can watch this 15 episode show. And then, if you want to comb through any other DC stuff, you can do so. But I would just say watch this show if you can, man. So I think it is spoiler time. Spoiler time. I think it's that time again to spoil the show. If you guys just kind of want to hear regardless of my thoughts, or if you've ultimately seen this show, a lot of people would just be like, why did he like it so much? Especially if you saw it. Or maybe after I describe some of the stuff that goes on to the show and you've never seen it, and maybe you had zero interest in seeing it regardless, and just want to hear what I have to say because you just like me talking about things. Okay. Um. So reasonably, I have to say that it seems like there is an abundance of this show that is blatantly getting ripped off from other things, and I don't mind. I really do not mind. Um, or I think it is honestly cool if they're doing it as an homage like thing. Man, do I really enjoy the fact that Robot Man had a very much like RoboCop like kind of intro, like an origin, like his origin had kind of a very much like a RoboCop kind of like origin story where you're kind of seeing um like Chief building Robot Man, and it's kind of like him consistently turning on and off, and and Robot Man talking to Chief and stuff like that, and just it was really awesome to see that kind of very much like RoboCop uh kind of opening or origin of that character. Man, Cliff and Jane, man, do those characters like really work well together, but then ultimately when really and honestly and actually looking at it, Cliff Robot Man works well with anybody. Because he is like the huge comic relief coming out of this show. Um Man, all of the stuff that they came up with for Brendan Fraser to say on the show, because ultimately, I think a lot of the times Brendan Fraser's character was singing a booth, um, saying all these words, because ultimately, I believe Negative Man and Robot Man had like their like stand-ins. They had stunt people or whoever come in here and do their performances, which is okay. Uh, yeah, why if you have a person covered head to toe or whatever, why would they want to go out of their way to actually be the people in costume? You have like Robert Downey Jr.'s that kind of do the same thing. Anyways, so yeah, so ideally when Negative Man shot off, or when we first got to see like Negative Man, I was adamantly looking at Negative Man, and I was like, is Negative Man gonna be a gay character? Interesting. And then looking at it, like that's exactly the way that they go with this character, is like, especially during probably the time of which this character was very much like a person that didn't really feel like secure about revealing themselves about being gay or being bi curious or whatever. But funny enough, we do have like Danny, I believe his name, Danny the Street, that is very much bi curious and kind of like let people express themselves as whoever or whatever they are. At the end of the day, that was like ultimately that was just kind of a very bizarrish episode. But then looking at all of this stuff all together, there's a lot of bizarrish things going on. Come on, you have a donkey that like is like a portal, a donkey portal. You have a cockroach and a rat just making out with one another, and I'm just like, why? You have a butt balloon. You have Attack of the Butts. You have Brendan Fraser, who is consistently having sex with his nanny consistently. You have, here's a random visual. You have a butt balloon, and at the very end of that butt balloon, you have this record player that is playing a song that is making everyone around them crazy. And then bizarrely, the cops turn in pinatas, and people are breaking into the pinatas, eating the candy. And what a bizarre story that this one episode turns into. But that's not all. So Cliff is probably like the best thing about this show. And you know what? Cliff goes in and is busting chops on everybody. Oh my god. I love the iterations between Cyborg and Cliff, where ultimately a lot of times when like Cliff or when Cyborg falls short, Cliff like really digs into him about it, where it's just like, well, yeah, hey, like Aquaman never forgets the keys, or like, hey, like what's Batman like, or something like that, or like, hey, I bet you've probably never met Batman, or this or that. But man, Cyborg man, you have this whole thing about him and his complete lack of trust, especially towards his father, because considering his father is basically like giving him this robot technology, but is putting the training wheels on and like and keeping Cyborg at the kids' table, and to ultimately that huge amount of mistrust between a father and son eventually kind of build up to this big, huge escalation towards the end of this show. And I'm like, man, that was so brilliant. That was so masterful. It is kind of really bizarre though, which I ultimately have to go out of my way to say. So Cyborg's dad mentions that Cyborg is delicious. And I'm like, oh my god. Like, I wonder if he said that as like trying to break his other actor or something like that. Or like he just threw that line in there just to be comedic or fun. But god, I think the greatest line has to be, and I just busted out laughing so hard during this point. When we find out that Cyborg could quite possibly kill all of the Doom Patrol, Cliff goes and mentions and asks Cyborg if he's feeling any psychopathic tendencies. He's like, hey, let me know if you're feeling any like psychopathic tendencies. And he like grabs the screwdriver and he's like, I'm like, oh my god, that is like the funniest joke of this entire series. Is, and I don't know if I said that like word for word or whatever, but anyways, it's just like that has got to be like the funniest freaking thing in this entire show, of when like you have this character that is really busting chops but is doing it like really well, to where you're just like dying laughing at points because he's just ribbing people. And like a lot of the stuff is a lot of like references and stuff like that that really does work. It is kind of very odd at one point where like Cliff is talking to Cyborg but calls him Hawkman. And I'm well, clearly it's kind of making even a joke that these characters aren't actually probably physically like I'm sure the voice for Cliff and the voice for Negative Man aren't actually in the environments. At a lot of points it does obviously sound like these characters are at a sound booth somewhere. It doesn't always sound like these people are actually there in person saying these words of dialogue. It comes off very as if they're in a sound booth somewhere and they're saying these things as an afterthought, or whatever, or as a prior cut. It sounds like that. Um, but looking at it, the lines are still funny. The lines are still hilarious. I think at points Cliff does tend to overly cuss, and I mean cuss a lot. But then also looking at it, like when looking at it, it's funny. It's like it never gets to the point where it's like, come on, Cliff, can you just kind of like, does every word have to be the F word? Does every word have to be like any other cuss word? Can't you just speak normally? But man, when you have Cliff kind of really organizing this like family therapy episode, and reasonably like you really get to the feeling that these characters don't really and truly know one another. And I think Cliff is just like, god, I really got to get something off my chest, but ultimately looking at it like, I don't know enough about all these people, so I want to know their like deepest darkest secrets. Like I want to know like if like my life is really as equally as miserable as these other people, or if they're worse. And like and maybe this guy just really likes like a Jerry Springer like kind of atmosphere or something. Because clearly maybe his life was a very much Jerry Springer like atmosphere, especially when he had his roadie buddy going and sleeping with his wife and this and that at portions and this and that. Anyway, so we get to where ideally we have Cliff who, like, I assumed he was going to get into a car accident with in his race, but then ultimately that's kind of swerved and it's like, oh no, the real actual car accident is just like him eventually like driving with his wife and his kid, um and that's where the accident happens. Like, oh, okay, so kind of a little bit of swerve there. But Jane is probably the most like overall just most amazing thing about this entire show. And when ultimately you have a episode completely devoted to Jane, like I think that was the most interesting episode that like was a solo episode. I'm like, yeah, awesome. We get to know about Jane and how bizarre and weird and how many of her 64 personalities is going to be on screen in one episode. Um, and how we visually got to finally see what Hammerhead looked like, or any number of personalities that we wouldn't normally get to see because she only used a certain kind of set of personalities. Um, but it was funny how when every time, because it works perfectly to where Cliff is consistently working with Jane, because ultimately whenever because Cliff is the most rookie to Jane's flipping of personalities. So ultimately, anybody else would quickly be able to adjust, knowing full well that it's like, okay, well, uh, uh, this is Jane's next personality. This is Jane's next personality. Once she starts talking, okay, it's this personality. Where Cliff is new to this show, so to speak, and so every time she switches to another personality, Cliff has a very hard time dealing with it. And every time he has some kind of reference of who this character is, at some point he goes out of his way to call one of the personalities like Tiny Tim, because that's exactly what she sounds like, and it's freaking hilarious. Um, and again, every time one of these personalities, like all of a sudden, especially Hammerhead, which eventually kind of like swears her way through her day and kind of destroys a lot of stuff. Um, Cliff is just like, yeah, I like man, this girl's cool, but then also it's just like, God, is she a bear to just kind of deal with? Because looking at it, it's like I want to talk to this one kind of girl within this one person, but I'm ultimately getting a huge shuffle of several other things that I don't like, and have to just deal with. Um, but anyways, one thing that I could say is there are characters that, if I didn't mention, like Cyborg, I really like his story. Regardless of, I feel that he's fighting for real estate. Uh, the mistrust is great, but then looking at it, like I don't really like this character. It just doesn't like, just doesn't quite work within this team. It just doesn't. Also, I just kind of feel like Negative Man and Elastigirl just just are kind of are just either kind of buzzkill characters, or just they're just not, like, especially Elastigirl. I love the actor that plays Elastigirl. It's not her. It's just her character is just like, good God. Her character is just so, like, overall, even through story arcs and everything like that, like, I just never like this character. I love the fact that she's an old movie starlet that was ultimately trying to maintain her fame. Um, but eventually, she, over time, was there's new stars that come in every day, and eventually she was forgotten about. There seems to have been a lot of times where she has to kind of mention like her run as being an actress, or the fact that she has she even kind of mentions how she is kind of past her prime or whatever, or that there's like there's new people coming in, and like she's kind of like very wispy to kind of keep trying at this or whatever, and this and that, and kind of like that's where I think like there's kind of a very much like buzzkill kind of mentality for this character, and a lot of the times it's just this person is only presented on this show for you to consistently see her struggle with this malfunction of this power. So if anything, this entire season is about this girl struggling with her power to maintain it to where she can ultimately like be able to do something as simple as walk up a flight of stairs, or be able to make it to breakfast, or make it to this meeting that this team has, because there's something dragging her down, aka her power. um it kind of gets very annoying with that, to where it's just like, god, all of this character is just kind of like, in a metaphorical sense, she's kind of just dead weight. Because a lot of the times, I just don't see enough good use of this character. And a lot of times, she's like a buzzkill character. With Negative Man, man, I loved like the comic book run of this character. Looking at it at this, like looking at this character, just felt like a lot of this character was very repetitive. Probably out of all of the characters, this character was probably the most like repetitive character out of everything. It felt like every time that there was something to put for Negative Man, it was just like, God, it just felt like I've seen this already, and I've seen this already, and I've seen this already, and like I don't need to see more of this. Why do they need to take so much time to focus on this one thing? Where is it going? Why drag this out so much? This could have been a shorter season without them dragging stuff out so much. But while you have these bizarre things being presented in the show, kind of going back into me talking about the series as a whole. Um, Reasonably, when looking at it, there's several things specifically that Jane does that I'm like, oh my god, this is amazing. Like how you have Jane that otherwise has these personalities that she writes words into the sky, and then those words turns into swords, and she kills people with said swords, was awesome. How this character has a wide variety of different personalities, where a lot of the personalities are just kind of there to either be comedic or have some kind of quirky or odd thing that eventually has some kind of payoff somewhere down the road later on. But looking at it, how we had several kind of bizarrish villains within this show, like the de-creator, to where they had to have the counter thing of recreator. How they had the Bureau of Normalcy or whatever it was called. Where anything that seemed out of place, they had to go out of the way to chase and try to um the guys in the ant farm. They had to go and try to go out of the way to find and find these people that were very one of a kind like people, and torture them into like either killing them or torturing them so that way they could uh get them to use their power more or dissect them or whatever. Um that was a lot of fun to be placed within this. Like I didn't think any villain, even with Mr. Nobody, like every villain was, yeah, a lot of points. Like the whole Nazi thing again was kind of bizarre, but looking at it, like every bizarrish like villain, I think was great. It was fun. It was a very fun adventure. Every episode seemed like a very bizarre and yet fun adventure. Um, how looking at it, the whole like one episode seemed to be really going really wild and out there, but when you're constantly seeing butts being presented within the show in a very comedic like sense, what can you do? Anyways, so how long have I been talking about the show? 41 minutes. Okay. So, at the end of the day, there could also be some episodes within this show that honestly could be more of a miss than a hit. Maybe even the last episode could honestly been just one of those where it's like this is how they are gonna go and end this show, huh? But when looking at it all together, they gave you 15 episodes. Um, and it seems like it is really great how they go out of their way to do this out there story that ends up having some payout um towards a later episode, or makes you reflect on a character that you didn't think was going to have any kind of importance. Um, that is a great thing. That is an awesome thing where a character that you didn't think you had to care about, all of a sudden after it shows you like some kind of new character that they're working on or showcasing, they turn back around and make that character important later on, and you're like, oh my god, wow. So that character that was just like, why have this character? It's freaking bizarre. Ultimately it pays off later, and then you're just like, oh my god, wow. What an ingenious decision to make a character that like I was like, this is so random, but then it pays off later on. I think that's the best show when like, especially because a lot of shows don't care to do any payouts for anything, or kind of just put things in a show for reasons that don't make any sense. But this show goes out of its way to make sense of something that does make sense. It goes out of its way to cleverly write something in as a joke, but it has a payoff. And yeah, so one thing that I also loved is when Robot Man was like fighting uh those guys. I think he was fighting the Nazi guys, and he like ripped a guy literally in half, and then beat that bottom half of a man's body uh onto another person, just took that bottom half and smacked that bottom half of a person's body and smacked it up against some other person. I was like, oh my god, this is awesome. When they actually did get into fights within this show, it seems like the fights were actually worth your while, were actually worth watching. It did seem like the fights were at a big scale. It seems like minions were just coming out of the woodwork and they were never going to stop or they were never going to end. And at some points, like even the heroes did have to give up at some point and run or turn tail or whatever. Um, that was the great thing about this show, where even the heroes knew when that they were not going to win this fight, or they were not like they were going up against an unbeatable foe, and so they had to like adjust on the fly, or otherwise like they were just like, I have no clue of what to do. And so everybody's running around with a chicken with their head cut off until they come up with some kind of solution. Um, but yeah, so at the end of the day, when looking at it, reasonably, I think if Robot Man wasn't who he was via the way he was written, via the actor that was put in here, via everything, I think that this could have maybe drastically changed altogether what this show was. But I also think the kind of maybe random additions that were added onto the show, the adjustments that were made via the time that these characters were showcased on Titans, the adjustments that were made to this show when it actually was an actual show, really did drastically overall change how I felt about the show. I'm like, oh man, they changed a lot of stuff. They got several different actors that I wasn't gonna think that they could have gotten. Like I didn't think that they were gonna add people that I wasn't aware of. Jane was a character that I wasn't aware of, and so but ultimately, I liked how they kind of overall, as much as possible, tried to showcase like the history of the Doom Patrol, knowing that there had been several iterations. Like they had the whole episode of Mento, which I'm like, oh yeah, I remember Mento from the Teens Titans episode, and so ultimately I knew about when Brain was referenced on this episode. I'm like, oh yeah, like I know Brain, like I know him from the Teen Titans episode as well, and knowing full well that they had like Brain ended up having like a gorilla as an assistant, which they reference on the show. Um, and I was like, yeah, so like technically, so Doom Patrol still had this evil villain that was a brain inside of a robot like thing. Uh, at the end of the day, it would just be kind of interesting if they were ever to do a second season to just bizarrely throw that brain villain back into the mix. Just like F it, just have fun with it. Um, but I also did like the fact that um, they did kind of also just kind of like say, hey, like we gave you a conclusion for some of these characters that you might have heard of in some past and whatever. Anyway, so looking at it, man, was this a good show? There's so many things that I could have gone on and on and on about. Especially knowing the guy who was on the Supernatural show that played the character Crowley. I was like, oh my god, he's on this show. Sadly enough, he was only on here for like one episode. So I was like, man, it would have been great if like this character would have been somehow used for like the entire season somehow, because I just really like I think his name is Shepard, Mark Shepard, maybe from Supernatural. It would have been cool if they would have been able to work this character in. It was just kind of bizarre how he's just kind of used in an episode, and then he just kind of left, and I was like, this seems so weird. But every episode was very weird. It was like they just kind of toss a lot of things in there, for the sake of just kind of tossing a lot of things in there. So, anyways, for the sake of not making a super long review, because I can go on for probably an hour and talk about the show more and more and more, and how much I really overly enjoyed it, and like having weird things like Danny the Street, or having weird things that I might have probably talked about at some portion and probably forgot that I probably mentioned it. Or there's probably, when looking back at this review, I'm gonna be like, oh man, I forgot to mention this, or I forgot to mention that. Yeah. Because I know there's gonna be something on here where I'm like, oh my god, I completely forgot about mentioning this. Because I tried this once before and I kind of mentioned some things and whatever, and a lot of stuff is like quickly fading out of my mind of this whole review thing. So at the end of the day, I think I have to just kind of go out of my way to just kind of end it here. At the end of the day, maybe I might go into part two about reviewing this and going in depth more, talking about it more, talking about how I felt about it. But maybe people won't have the interest past this one review. So, if anything, I am going to get out of here because at the end of the day, this was a great show. So I don't know if I could say much more than that, as I felt it was a great show. But I don't know if everyone's felt the same or felt as equal. So, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.